G'day, you mob. Welcome to this episode of Aussie English, the number one podcast for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English. G'day, guys. Today is an episode of the Goss, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. I think you're going to enjoy it, especially if you are a whale or shark enthusiast, someone who likes whales or sharks, right? If you've got a bit of an animal lover's heart, I think that you'll enjoy this episode. So effectively what happened was that over the last few weeks I've been gathering some stories together, and I noticed a sort of pattern that a number of these stories were about whales and about sharks. So I cleared out the other stories for this week and just decided to sit down with Dad and chat about our sea-dwelling friends. Although sharks, I don't know if they're friendly or not, but they definitely scare me more than whales. And dolphins. We talk about dolphins too. So anyway, there are some really fascinating stories, guys. We talk about whales washing up on beaches dead and what that means in terms of trying to manage that biohazard problem because, you know, tens of tons of dead animal tend to be not very healthy, not very conducive to healthy, leisurely activities if you like going to the beach. We talk about sharks attacking whales and killing them. Right? So there was some incredible drone footage of this great white shark attacking a whale and successfully killing it and then predating it, eating it. So we talk about that story. We also talk about the migration of southern right whales and humpback whales and also how they were almost hunted to extinction by whalers in the early years of Australian colonisation. But anyway, guys, without any further ado, I give you my dad, Ian Smissen, and I having a yarn. Enjoy this episode of The Goss. Let's get into it. So, Dad, what's going on?
Hey, not much, Pete.
It's
another beer day.
Yeah, so you were saying you really like these beers because they are by Mick Fanning, right?
No, that's Bolter. This one's from Bells Beach, so it's another surfing sort of thing. But I don't think this is owned by a surfer necessarily.
I associated it with Mick Fanning because of Bells Beach. But sorry, Mick.
No, sorry,
Bolter.
Mick. Bolter. Balter. And yeah,
Good.
look, I do like this beer as well, and it's a local, so...
it's easy drinking.
Easy drinking. And I do like Bolter because Mick Fanning and a couple of his surfer buddies, Mick Fanning, for those of you who aren't into surfing, is famous for two things. He was a world champion several times on the World Surfing Tour, and he's also the guy whose board got bitten by a shark.
Well, his leg rope, right?
Yeah, his leg rope.
The great white shark grabbed his leg rope and pulled him backwards a bit, and he was like kicking like crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and crazily enough, all the other surfers came out to help him.
Yeah.
Well, that were in the heat or whatever it was.
That's
I think
right.
that was at Bells Beach, wasn't it? Or was that elsewhere?
I think it might have been South Africa.
Okay.
But
something completely different.
Yeah, but he's he and a couple of his mates have started this brewery called Bolter.
Yeah.
And the reason I like it, apart from supporting local people trying to do well, is because a lot of the profits go to homeless kids on the Gold Coast where it's set up and where he lives, encouraging him to get into surfing and go to school. So that's got to be a good thing. So.
Yeah, he seems like a really kind dude.
He's an interesting
Looking
guy.
into him after his surfing career, I think he's been working hard to sort of help a lot of people.
Yeah, and mostly homeless kids, I think, because he grew up as a surfer on the Gold Coast, and obviously there's a lot of homeless kids and unemployed youth in the Gold Coast region. So.
Yeah. So today I had a whole bunch of stories that I've sort of racked up over
the
the
last
last
few
few
much,
weeks.
so I haven't even got a puppies and kittens story.
No?
And the idiot of the week is the same one, so...
Oh, yeah, I should say cheers.
Cheers.
But I got a bunch of whale stories and shark stories.
Whales and sharks today, so no puppies and kittens. But
somehow I ended up getting a whole bunch of stories. I think there was like 2 whale ones and a shark one. And then I was like...
Once you find one, then
get a few
the
others
search
there.
engine just finds them for you.
So I thought we could start by saying, today's episode should be a whale of a time.
I got nothing. I don't have a pun that's that bad, so I'm
couldn't
just going to
think
have
of
to
a
let it
shark
go.
expression. That was the only whale expression I could think of, a whale of a time.
No, it's not a great one, but it'll have to do.
That's the only one that I could find. Yeah. So, how do we get into this? I guess, do you want to give a bit of history in terms of whaling and Australia? Because that was one of the first industries in Australia.
It was an industry that's older than European Australia.
Yeah.
There were whalers and sealers, so people taking whales and seals, whales for whale oil, And before people discovered underground oil, digging it up and getting it out to use for various things, whale oil was used mostly for lighting.
So you would have lamps that would have whale oil
street
in
lights.
them. And street lights as well.
Yeah, street lights as
So
well.
are they some of those street lights that you still see in Melbourne, the really, really old ones?
They weren't whale oil, they were gas.
Okay.
Yeah, and the gas came after the whale oil.
But there would have been some.
And there
once
are
upon a
there are
time.
other bits, ambergris and things from whales where you get about a kilogram
vomit.
out of a 30-ton whale.
More than that. Some of them are crazy. I've got. So we can talk about ambergris. I was about to say maistage, which is Portuguese. I don't know why that came out, but
Hey, why not?
later.
Yeah, later.
But so when Australia was colonised, whaling was already sort of happening around the oceans.
Yeah, it
around
was.
Australia,
So
right?
there were people whaling around here, and certainly just after Sydney, or what became Sydney Cove, was settled, there were whalers around the south coast of Australia, in particular, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, which is where most of the whales have been and still are. Although we get humpbacks going up the east coast and the west coast during the summer, but year round they're mostly around the south coast of Australia. So people were here whaling and creating virtual settlements. They weren't permanent, but they were there for months and sometimes years. And not that people were there all the time, but they built little huts and things that they could come and go from. And then sealers did the same thing. Sealers were after seal skin for the fur because it's really dense fur and made good coats, mostly for
This would have been the
the
equivalent.
Northern Hemisphere winters.
It would have been the equivalent, I guess, of the beaver trade in the North America, in the United States and Canada before they were either of those.
Yeah, and look, the irony is that while they call them sealers and we generically call them seals, they're not seals. They're eared seals or sea lions.
They are. They're just not the same.
Yes,
They're
different
a different
family,
group.
different group of them. But whereas the seals that are mostly being taken for fur in the Northern Hemisphere are true seals. So.
And the difference between the two is effectively, that seals with the ones that you'll find around the coast of Australia will be the eared seals. And you'll see that they can lift their back legs can support their body weight, so they can actually hold their whole body weight up and sort of gallop along the ground.
Yeah.
So you'll see
rather than dragging themselves along the ground.
Yeah, whereas the seals like what would you say, elephant seals and everything,
seals, leopard seals,
closer
harbour
to
seals.
the poles, and they tend to drag they can't actually support their body weight with the back legs.
No, exactly. So.
But they're pretty cool animals, but it is pretty sad, right? Because you had these groups, I guess they would have been independent ships, right? Maybe groups of ships that were going through effectively just rampaging, like filling their ships with as much whale oil, skin, meat as they could, and then just going back to Europe and selling it, or selling it in the colonies.
I think it was mostly selling it back in Europe. Yeah.
I haven't done that much research on them aside from knowing that they were obviously in and around the place, but did they have any sort of real appreciation for the resource that they were harvesting and trying to maintain it, or they would just like get in there, take as much as you can?
Realistically, when we're talking about, certainly whaling, when you're talking about people with a whaling ship was even a fairly small ship.
Yeah.
And the actual hunting of whales was done in large rowboats. By sort of 8 to 10 men in a rowboat with a manually thrown, hand-thrown harpoon.
Well, the thing that comes to mind is, what is it, the white whale?
Moby Dick.
Yeah, the white whale going after him, and what's the story again? Is it called Moby Dick? The story?
Moby Dick is the name of the book.
Where they're chasing that white whale and obviously demonising it a bit. But and that was a sperm whale, I think.
Yeah.
But they were out in those dinghies, those small boats, 6 Roman or something, Orman, and they used those hand-thrown harpoons.
So, realistically, you're not going to catch a huge amount in comparison with what we can do now with factory ships and, and harpoons that are no longer being thrown by a person. They're coming out of a giant cannon on a ship.
And they electrocute them to kill them pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, I don't think that seals were different because
they would get
seals
them
were caught on land,
Yeah.
and so you're literally just going around and stabbing or clubbing the seals.
Yeah.
And so you could significantly impact the population of them, whereas whales, I don't think they did for a while. But then more and more people started to do it. and then the whale population started to crash.
Well, some of the rarest seals in the world are the Australian. Is it the Australian fur seal or Australian sea lion?
Australian sea lion.
Sea lion's the one that was
fur seal
really effective.
is threatened, or was, but it's there's a fairly large population of them. But the Australian sea lion, which occurs on the South Australian coast, the biggest population is on Kangaroo Island. Then their population is thousands. It's not hundreds of thousands.
Why has that taken so much longer to bounce back? Because I remember I was looking up today the statistics for, I think it was the humpback whale that was absolutely smashed by whaling. So counts conducted in 2006 indicate that from an estimated 200 to 500 humpbacks that were left in the wild in 1962, the current East Coast population has grown back to about 8,000 animals. And I think today there was a news story that came out that said now it's expected to be more than 35,000.
Yeah.
So last year's numbers were up by 486 from 2018. It's increasing 10 to 15% a year.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely insane, right? In terms of
it is.
You would think whales would breed a lot more slowly than that.
Well, they do.
The population can just bang.
Obviously,
bang.
they're fairly successful.
Yeah.
With very little hunting of whales now. It means that, if you've got 10 to 15%, it probably means that 50% of the adult females are pregnant in any 1 year. And so you're still got a fairly successful, population growth there. Southern right whales are the other ones. The reason they were called right whales is because they were the right whales to catch.
Yeah.
They had a lot of oil and they were slow and they weren't scared of boats. So they'd hang around. Same thing with humpbacks. It wasn't that they were necessarily the best whales to catch. They were the easiest whales to catch. Because even now, if you go out whale watching off the east coast of Australia, the humpbacks will come right up to the boats. They're
curious, right?
Yeah, they're curious. They want to know what's going on.
There was an insane video that I don't know if I'm covering this in today's list of stories, but there was an absolutely insane video. I think it was off
Beaumaris. Yes. Yeah.
So that was in the bay.
In Port Phillip Bay.
Yeah, which was just insane because
Shallow
you think
water.
the opening of the bay is probably 2 kilometres, 3 kilometres.
3 kilometres, yeah.
And there are ships going through there constantly. And Beaumaris is at the complete opposite end, right near Melbourne.
Yeah.
Effectively straight up. Yeah. It's 70 kilometres from the
Beaumaris
opening
is probably 50 kilometres to the heads. Yeah.
And so there was a guy in a small boat. It would have been like 4-meter dinghy where he was just fishing, and he's sitting there with his smartphone, and you just see the smartphone turn on or whatever, like the video starts, and he looks in the water, and there's I think it's a right whale right next to his boat, just twisting and looking.
Hello?
Yeah. And so I was so amazed at how gentle they can be.
Yeah, and look, they're obviously so aware of themselves in the water as well, where they can, they'll come right up next to a boat and then they'll flip around and you'd think, there's a danger of being whacked by their tail or whatever, but they don't. So.
Yeah. Well, it's just crazy. Yeah. And we were watching a documentary called The Magical Land of Oz, which has got Barry Humphries narrating it. And it's about, obviously, Australian wildlife, the Australian environment. And he was, showing a bunch of, I think they were humpback whales playing with dolphins.
Mm.
And so when they were coming up the coast, I think they were in the Great Bight, and they were going along the coast, whether to the west or to the east, to then go and breed up in the warmer waters. They just interacting with dolphins and just playing with them in the shallows. And you're just like, it's just crazy to see species of different species playing together. And
these are highly intelligent animals.
Well, it was the same. It was the same for the seals when they were showing the sea lions. I think there must have been fur seals as well or something, and they were showing, I think, at Kangaroo Island how they play in the rock pools when they're young in order to try and develop their skills,
learning swimming skills,
and there are multiple species and they're playing with one another. Yeah, and you're just like, isn't that crazy that for millennia these different species have been interacting with one another like that?
Yeah, and look, they interact with humans as well. I wonder if you've ever been swimming with seals. They are really interested in what's going on with you.
Yeah, they're like the little dogs, right, in the water, and except they're a lot more. What would you say? They can maneuver themselves in a much more delicate way,
exactly.
rapidly in the water. And it's so funny to see them out of the water because they seem so clumsy and like, but as soon as you see them in the water, they're like just fluid motions and they can move so quickly. It's just insane.
Yeah, last time I was swimming with seals was in the Galapagos about 5 years ago, and the pups in particular, sort of half grown, are really inquisitive.
Just no fear.
And no fear, and nothing in the Galapagos seems to have fear of humans. But and they actually come up and kiss nose the mask.
Really?
They're actually
It was
pushing
like,
the
"What is
mask
this?"
into your face, just very gently, but
Yeah.
just going, oh, I'm going to get as close. Like their whiskers are actually touching you.
See, I think I'd be crapping myself if I saw seals, because that would instantly tell me there's probably sharks nearby that are going to be hunting these seals.
You don't go swimming with seals off the coast of South Australia
Where they're
or
breeding.
Phillip Island.
Their colonies are.
Exactly.
Yeah, where there's a
'cause
big
great
smell.
white sharks just hang around going, oh.
Well, and that's
breakfast.
the stuff that they do, right? With, I think it's in New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, where they'll have boats with a boogie board that they'll cut into the shape of a small seal and drag across the surface of the water.
And funnily
they'll
enough, the sharks come up.
The great white sharks will be below and then just come up out of the water, grab them, and just bang, hit the surface and hopefully shred them to bits. But you're just like, this is just insane behavior. So going back to whaling, there were a number of whaling stations, and I guess that would have begun as soon as we colonised, or was that shortly after it where they became established?
Shortly after, where they became a supported commercial enterprise rather than just being the privateers who would just go and create their own little station somewhere. And whaling stations were created in order to do the factory work on land rather than having to do it on board ship, because particularly when you're doing you've got sailing ships, you've got no way of having a big enough ship that you can, as a small privateer, that you can get a big enough ship that you can actually be slaughtering, butchering, melting down, and doing all those sort of things. So
I wonder how they did it back then. I don't know enough about how the process of whaling was carried out, because you can imagine it must have been so arduous to try and go out and catch this 40-ton animal or whatever. Did they just drag it back into the whaling station? Because I assume it would have been impossible to get on board the boat itself, at least not without chopping it up in the water. Like how would you
I'm not sure how they
drag
did it
upon
back in the sailing
the
ship days,
boat?
but certainly the last, I think it was the last whaling station in Australia was in Albany in Western Australia, and it shut down sort of late 70s, early 1980s.
Really? I thought it was outlawed in the 60s.
No, I visited it in 1974 as a tourist on a school trip back 100 years ago. And so, 46 years ago. They were still, and that literally they would, the boats would just bring them up and then they'd just, hook them around the tail on a big winch and drag them up a ramp and butcher them on the ramp, basically. So, it was a fairly disgusting thing to go and see with,
Just because of
butchering.
the size?
Well, just, butchering any animal is not a particularly pleasant thing to see, but an animal of that size and the smell, because, the smell of a freshly killed animal is there isn't one really, but when you've got, just sort of literally blood and guts around all over the place, being washed back into the sea.
So do you remember what was going on with why they were wanting to outlaw it? Like, was there a big uproar at the time in Australia
issue.
and they realised the numbers were plummeting?
Yeah. And look, it was a conservation issue, was the push to kill off the industry, but the industry was dying anyway because there really just wasn't, we'd gone more than a century without requiring the use of whale oil,
right?
And got electricity and oil and gas and so on. And so there really just wasn't that much of an industry around whale products. So
yeah, and it was crazy. I guess it's sort of the industry went bananas in the mid 1800s, right? And they killed, I think, based on the numbers here, 40,000 whales on migration, at least throughout that period, which it sounds like a lot, but I guess it would have been spread across almost, 150 years, maybe 140, 130 years.
And several species.
Yeah.
So.
But that was obviously still, in terms of the humpback whales, got them down to numbers of 200 to 500 in the 60s. That was a big reason. They were just like, these are about to go extinct, so we need to do something.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you want to touch on a little bit about sea shepherd and Japan's hunting of whales? I mean, it's a touchy issue. I've had some Japanese followers at times criticize me wearing the sea shepherd T-shirt, saying that it's very offensive. And I guess I understand that they see that it's their right to be able to whale. But do you want to give us a sort of, I guess, Australian viewpoint of why we see sea shepherd as, I don't know about heroes, because they're kind of idiots at times too.
They're
and
anti-heroes almost.
yeah, it's almost like Greenpeace, right? They do a lot of dumb shit in order to. It's a means to an end.
Well, yeah.
But do you want to give
some
a
of
bit
that is about publicity
for the Japanese listening? Do you want to give them a bit of an idea of where Australians stand on whaling and why, so that they can at least understand?
And I think it comes from that movement in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s to wind down the Australian whaling industry, and it was conservation. It was just simply saying that there's no justification for catching whales anymore because the products that were traditionally being used from whales had all been replaced by other things.
Yeah, they were obsolete.
They're obsolete. It was no longer required. And from a conservation point of view, we had populations that were crashing and getting to near extinction point, where if you get less than 100 animals probably 200 in a population that will only breed every second or third year. With individuals, then the chance of that recovering while you're still hunting them is close to zero.
Well, and beyond that, you've lost a great deal of genetic diversity, so that the more you whittle it down, and it's probably an exponential thing. When you've got 10,000 individuals down from 100,000, it's probably like, okay, that's bad, but it's not that bad. But when you go from 10,000 to 1,000 or 1,000 to 100, you're losing exponentially more genetic diversity in that population.
The chance of genetic bottlenecks, which is that the biological term for it, where you're reducing the genetic diversity to the point where there's a significant chance that they will all be so closely related that you will either have reproductive problems or there are problems of disease or disaster that means that the genetic pool that you have is no longer able to cope.
Yeah.
So that was really where we were in the 50 or 60 years ago. And then I think whales just became, and they've always been a fascination for people, but I think they just became one of those signature animals for conservation because they're big, and obviously big means interesting, but they're intelligent as well. And that if you go whale watching, and many people do, you're actually interacting with the animal. It's not just, oh, look, there's a whale 500 metres offshore, leaping up in the air and going splash. In many cases, they're coming up to the boat and interacting with you. And I think that gives people a sort of an emotional response as well. Even if you never do it yourself, the idea that animals will do that has meant that many Australians simply say, well, why would we be killing these animals? And so, look, the other side, of course, is that Japanese, Norwegians, Icelanders, Alaskans are saying that, well, this is something that we do. We just catch whales for food. This is no longer about whale oil or any of those things. It's about food. The counter-argument to that is, do you need to eat whales? Now, some small indigenous populations, that's the food they've got. You live in northern Canada or Alaska, and you're a small indigenous population, there's not much else to eat.
And it would be like if there were still indigenous people living in Tasmania or something, and they were like, well, it's our culture to hunt and kill and consume Tasmanian devils. You would be like, all right, I understand it, but they're also endangered, and we want to at least make sure that whatever you end up doing is sustainable to the point that the Tasmanian devil as a species isn't going to be impacted negatively.
And we have indigenous populations in northern Australia who have traditional food is turtle.
Yeah,
and
which tend to be endangered species. That
4 or 5 species are endangered or threatened, all of which live in Australia and breed in Australia.
Yeah,
and our laws allow those indigenous populations to continue to hunt and eat turtles. But those populations of indigenous people are also the ones that are involved in the conservation.
Exactly.
They're the ones that are helping the conservation by retaining breeding beaches and isolating them and helping people move eggs when there are cyclones that destroy beaches and so on. So it's in their interest to be involved in the conservation as well.
And I think that's a big part of it. It's educating them, saying, it's one thing for you to go out and kill these turtles, but we want to maintain that population so that you can continue to do that forever, and so that the ecosystem stays as healthy as possible. And so if you can be empowered with the information and knowledge to further this cultural practice for yourselves, as well as allow everyone else to have those species. But the biggest problem with that sort of thing, hunting animals like turtles and whales, is that they're not locally isolated. They move around a great deal.
Yes.
And so if you're hunting turtles on the beaches of Australia in summer when they're coming up and laying eggs and they're found on the reef and they're full of all these eggs that you can eat, it's it's sort of like you think, okay, well, the turtles are from here. It's like, no, they actually migrate to the other side of Singapore or something.
Yeah.
And they may be part of another culture's
all
food.
the way across the Pacific.
Exactly. And so you sort of need that bigger perspective as well and a better understanding of their biology, or else you can negatively impact other people elsewhere, other ecosystems elsewhere. And so
I think there's also a difference with, and not just Indigenous, but any individual people who are out fishing, in this example, in the case of turtles and whales, or even fish.
They're doing it on a small scale.
They're doing it to feed themselves. It's not a commercial enterprise where there is.
They would have no leg to stand on if they were like, we're going to buy all these big turtling ships,
exactly.
and we're just going to
sell them to Malaysia
scale.
Or wherever. But
it's our right.
So I think that's the difference in that if you're taking endangered animals because it's a cultural thing and you're doing it to feed yourself, then you are taking enough to feed yourself. It therefore is going to be sustainable. Whereas as soon as it becomes commercial and there's a self-interest in collecting more because you can sell more, then that's a problem.
This is the thing with whaling, I guess, and the issue that we had with the Japanese in Australia was not because they were Japanese and not even necessarily because they were killing whales, although I think for the average person in the street, if you were to just say to them, are you okay with someone killing whales? They would give you a sort of like, oh, that's a really horrible thing to be doing. But you could just say, well, we do the same thing to cows, to sheep, to all these other animals that are arguably just as sentient as whales, maybe not as intelligent. Yeah. But the issue was that at least the Japanese boats were coming into Australian waters.
Yeah,
right?
Well, he's coming through Australia. Oh.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below, or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.